But come back in this system, we're going to talk about how we can detect that touch on a specific object. So let's head into the studio, and here I'm going to start with an application called Touch an Object. And let's go ahead and get started with our code. Yes, I'm going to go to my activity. I'm going to actually make an object. When I want to basically detect the touches on it. Let's say we don't have this text view. Instead, I actually have a view. The simplest of the objects, a view is just a simple square that doesn't really do anything. It can be used as container for other objects, but it doesn't really do anything on its own. I'm going to go ahead and say the background for it. Let's say the background for it is this kind of orange, yellow, red kind of color is called red view. So called red view. And now I'm going to go ahead and say it is actually 500 deep, which is actually too much. They think that deep by 300 deep. So it's got the same with height, and also it is centered horizontally and centered vertically. So it's right in the middle of my screen, and it is called a red view. And that's all I'm going to be doing in my interface builder. Now I'm going to head into my main activity. Now, writing the code to detecting it touched on an object is rather simple, but I want to show you a few different ways so we get a bit more confidence in terms of writing code enforcement. So let's put aside the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to say, read you, and then I'm going to read you. Sits untouched listener. There are a few different types of methods that we can using here. For now, I'm going to use this one, and I'm going to say we get the view, we get the motion event, and then victim here, we have to actually do. Our very first thing I want to do is I want to say, let's get the view, whatever is the viewing. And then do a performance. So I'm going to say perform click, and that basically to read a warning that you had over there. And now the rest of it is exactly like what we did in our previous listen. This is our motion event, or motion event has something called action NASP. The action must know whether the action is up or down or move or whatever, and then you do a stuff depending on that. So, for instance, I could go ahead and say when let's say motion is granted to that action mask. So I'm inlining everything up, putting everything together in one line instead of writing it separately. I'm going to say when motion of an action mask, let's go ahead and say, for instance, I could say motion events that action down. So in the mode of the action. Now do this, and then I'm going to go ahead and say that it's another one motion event. The action up in the action up. I want to do this other thing. And just like the last time we think any of these, we actually have to return a value. So I'm going to go ahead and say in this one, it's true, also in this one with and through. And then there is still one more condition that the wind is actually warning us about. There's a little red underlined squiggly line under it that says there's still one condition that you haven't taken care of, and that is the X. So I'm going to say, if none of these things was happening, let's go ahead and say it is also true. So you have to make sure you take care of all the different conditions. If it is a situation like this one that the teacher wants to know which one is happening. And now for us, the only thing I really wanted to try in here was this, so I could go ahead and say tossed, and then I'm going to say post in here and do whole staff read. The view was touched. And that's pretty much all I want to do in here. So, red, you said don't touch this, and perform, and then find what kind of touch has been done, and then decide what you want to do when that touch lands on it. I'm going to go ahead and write this application. Now, let me put up my Android emulator. And from now, if the application loads up, I should be able to touch on the red view, but not anywhere else. So here, when I touch, nothing happens to red. You and I touch it, says red. You was touched. And you can imagine that you can simply expand on this application and make it that for any object that you touch, you can find the name of that object and show it. Or you could change some sort of properties on a scale of them, the alpha of them, or whatever you want to be doing for that particular application. Now, I told you earlier on at the beginning that I want to show you a few different ways of writing this code, and let's have a look at how else we could write. And if you're wondering why I would want to suggest another way, is simply because if you keep writing the code like this between the body of onCreate, soon enough you can create would be rather busy. And that's basically what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to find a way that I don't write everything within the body of my onCreate. Unfortunately, This part of the recipe was set on touchless. Now it must happen within the uncreate. There are obviously other ways of mitigating the situation. For instance, you could come in here and say, I'm going to close my uncreate function here. I'm going to add a new function, I'm going to call it my touch function starts, and then this might touch function does a. All of these things I'm going to put them, I touch within my uncreate, just maybe I can modularize my code a little bit so things become a little bit cleaner. There is another way, which is this type, the return that we want for the untouched listener. I'm actually going to go ahead and put it between a new function. So let's see how I'm going to do that. I'm going to say this is another function. Let's say this function. Let's call it my touch return. Well, anything that you want to be calling it, the thing that really matters about this function is that it returns a view that on touch listener, and you probably have to import your view, which is by holding Alt Enter and saying import. And now I've got a function called my touch then that returns a view on touchless center. And now I could go ahead and say for this one, we have to write the body of it. The one thing that is very important is that we have to return some value from it. So I'm going to say it and value my touch value, let's call it that is going to be viewed that on touchless. And if I can type it correctly in touch listener, and then the untouched listener in here is very similar to the one that we used over there. It could be exactly the same piece of code. In fact, I'm actually going to copy this entire code because it's going to be exactly like that. So I'm going to say my antiris is something like that. Again, it has a value. It has emotional event. Again, we do perform click again. We decide about all of these things. The one thing that's going to be different in this function is that once we calculated all of that here, at the end of this untouched listener, I'm going to say return on what do I want that I want to return. My touch value. You could, of course, to this whole thing in one go. You could actually say, instead of putting it between an argument, I could say just return a copy. This I could say just return this entire thing. And now that's another way of marginalizing your code and making sure that your code goes into a separate function. And this way you have a cleaner code when it comes to your mind control and create. Now, the way you could be using this one is very simple. I could go ahead and say that's that one out. Let's say read the view. And in the view, I'm going to say sits on touch listener and then the set on touchless in one of them. This one wants a return, which is of the type view and motion of it. And that's exactly what we have in here. We have a new listener. So I'm going to say set on I and my touch return so it automatically calculates everything that you want for that view and you add a listener for it. So a few different ways of doing it. Either you put this entire thing within the body of your uncreate or you put a new function with a return type that you need. And then obviously we can call that function within your untouched listener. As always, you could put these in separate files to make sure that your code doesn't become bloated very easily. The reason I keep suggesting about this modular raising and maintenance of these earlier stages is simply because soon enough you would have applications with hundreds of lines of code and you can't just be putting them all within one file. It would be very clear that it would be very difficult to read, not just for you, for anyone who wants to work with you. Is just basically a good practice of knowing how to keep your code very clean and very well organized to be very readable. So that's about that for touching a particular object. Let's give it up to here. Let's move on to our next lesson.